this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. So tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
When Kohler, global design leader in luxurious kitchen and bath products, asked me to be their ambassador for timeless, elegant, durable cast iron, I said, I'm in. Soon after, I was in their Kohler, Wisconsin foundry, watching molten iron poured, enamel applied by hand, and the beautiful finished pieces ready to ship. Since 1883, Kohler cast iron has been crafted by incredible artisans, and seeing it firsthand gave me a whole new appreciation for their craftsmanship. Now, I'm proud to lend my stamp of approval to my favorite Kohler cast iron products for their durability, beauty, and enduring style. Shop my curated picks at Kohler.com. As the Kohler cast iron ambassador, I say, long live cast iron.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 1103 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Many of you are familiar with the ZAP model. There's one at running back, wide receiver, and tight end, and the model aims to project a player's fantasy output across his first 3 seasons in the NFL. That's been something that you've read and listened about for years now. And many of you know that draft capital is sort of the foundation of those models. Everything revolves around where a player gets drafted, and it pivots off of that based on various inputs: age-adjusted production, size, teammate scores, program strength, and so on. A typical wide receiver drafted 50th overall might be expected to have a ZAP score of, say, 65. But if he has really good inputs, that number can be a lot higher. If the inputs are bad, then it can be lower. Those models have served me well through the years. They're helpful tools during your rookie drafts to help you make better decisions. But for a while now, I've been wondering why that logic stops with the NFL draft. Why create a model like that only for prospecting? Why not do something similar for our season-long leagues? That's what myself and Brandon Gdula have been working on this offseason. And for the first time, I'm talking about it with all of you. Introducing Market Score. Now, before I dive deeper into this, I did want to remind you to check out the brand new lateround.com. You can become a member, become a subscriber straight on the website now, not Patreon. You can pre-order the 2026 draft guide if you'd like, or you can just look at how pretty the site is. Regardless of what you do, at least check it out, lateround.com. Market score is a metric that lets us see if a player is overvalued or undervalued by the market. It looks at a player's average draft position, it factors in some previous season numbers, and it says, this player is expected to play above or below expected this year. Let me explain this a little bit further. I talk about average draft position expectation all the time on the show and in the draft guide. Essentially, when you do a little bit of regression analysis, you can find the number of points per game we'd expect a player to score at a particular ADP. A wide receiver selected 50th overall based on history might be expected to score something like 13 PPR points per game. That's his expected points per game. Now, obviously, if he was drafted earlier, that expectation would rise. If he's later, it would fall. Market score takes that number, it factors in some previous season analytics, and it tells us how many points above or below that number we should expect the player to score, all based on his ADP. So just like the ZAP model, this is centered around market value, but instead of draft capital, it's average draft position. The obvious problem that pops up is that ADP is dynamic. It changes and it fluctuates. Draft capital, once it's set from the NFL draft, we're good to go. And that's definitely going to be something I've got to talk about when I reference market score within my content. The formula might like a player in May or June, but if his cost really changes through the summer, then all of a sudden we could be looking at the player totally differently, at least through the lens of market score. Now look, me talking about this, I'm sure you're curious about what Market Score says about players here in 2026. But before we get into that, I want to share sort of the historical numbers with this metric to really wrap your head around what this is doing. Average draft position is a pretty good indicator of how good or bad a player is going to be. But just like draft capital, it is far from flawless. And just like draft capital, there are parts of the draft, mostly in the middle and late rounds, where average draft position becomes far less predictive. For example, middle round tight ends, something I've talked about for years now. They really just suck. As in, we're terrible at predicting which ones are going to be good. Tight ends pick 61st, so just after round 5 through pick 120, or through round 10 of a 12-team league, there's zero correlation between where the tight end was drafted within that range and how many points per game that tight end scored. The R-squared is 0.7%, meaning ADP explains virtually none of the variation in fantasy scoring for tight ends drafted in that range. It's irrelevant. But with Market Score, we get that R-squared to about 14%, which isn't like going to solve all of our problems, but it directionally gets us into the right place. Throughout your draft, in general, Market Score is more predictive than ADP. And there are certain spots where historically, it's been insanely more predictive. Like with middle round quarterbacks. Quarterbacks drafted in that same range, that round 6 through round 10 range, we have an R-squared of 1.3% when looking at ADP versus actual points per game since 2014. With Market Score, so if we replace expected fantasy points per game on ADP with a player's expected fantasy points per game via Market Score, that R-squared shoots up to 23%. That's pretty crazy. Now, I could go on and on talking about this, but the TLDR is that this has been tested, and throughout your draft, Market Score is going to be more predictive than average draft position, or at least average draft position expectation. Otherwise, why would we want to have a model like this, right? There would be no point to have Market Score if it wasn't more predictive than what ADP is just generally giving you. Now, just to be clear, Market Score can be both positive and negative, and it generally will range from like -4 to +4, meaning a player would be expected to score between -4 to +4 PPR points per game above or below his expected points per game. A score of 0 would mean he's simply expected to score what his ADP says he'll score. He's being drafted in the right place. Let's start with quarterback to really wrap our heads around this concept. When looking at early round quarterbacks or top 60 picks since 2014, quarterbacks with Market Scores below -0.5 have beaten expectation by 2 or more points per game at a 25% rate. They've underperformed versus expectation by 2 or more points at a 38% rate. When that Market Score is above 1 though, the opposite end, when Market Score is saying this quarterback is undervalued by at least 1 point per game, we see those quarterbacks outperform expectation by 2 or more points per game at a 36% rate. So that's 11 percentage points higher than when they were at -0.5 or lower in Market Score. And then they underperform by 2 or more points per game at just a 9% rate. So essentially, I can look at all of this in a similar way that I do other analysis for the draft guide each year. I can find a player's Market Score at a certain position, and I can see how frequently that player played really far above or really far below expectation in that given year. Now, as for results, since 2025 is fresh in our minds, let's go over some of those. And I'm only going to include players who ended up playing 8 or more games so we have enough of a sample to judge their points per game outputs. Last year, unfortunately, the best value by Market Score at quarterback was Jalen Hurts. This is not off to a good start. I was in on him too, and he underperformed versus expectation. His Market Score was plus 2.6 last year, meaning the metric thought that he'd outperform his ADP expectation by 2.6 points per game. But he underperformed by 1.1 points per game. Since 2014, we've had 15 other quarterback seasons where the quarterback entered the year with a Market Score above 1.5. So Hurts was a good bit above that. Of those 15, 3 of them failed to play 8 or more games. So there's 12 remaining quarterbacks. And of those 12 quarterbacks, only 3 of them played below expectation. So essentially, Jalen Hurts underperforming last year wasn't something that we'd seen very frequently with his type of Market Score. Aside from Hurts, though, on the top of the list in Market Score last year, we had Josh Allen. He played over 2 points above expected. Caleb Williams, he also played 2 points above expected. And then Brock Purdy played 4 points above expected. Those were the top players at quarterback within market score last year. On the flip side, the 4 biggest fades at quarterback according to market score were Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, Lamar Jackson, and Jordan Love. Now, Goff technically played above expected, albeit barely. But the other 3, they technically played below expected, especially Baker Mayfield, who ended up busting, and then Lamar Jackson. He busted even more. And then there's the running backs who were drafted in the top 10 rounds by ADP. Like quarterback, we had a pretty big miss at the top of the list at running back in Alvin Kamara. He played 3.8 PPR points per game below expected when his market score was plus 2.8. That's a big miss. But the other players at the top of that list, Breece Hall played slightly above expected, Zach Charbonnet well above expected, and then Devon Achane and Jahmyr Gibbs. Both of them crushed last year. Now on the flip side, market score didn't like Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. That was solid. It didn't like Nick Chubb, who barely squeezed into that range based on the ADP source that we're using over at fantasydata.com. But that was obviously a win. It didn't like RJ Harvey very much. That was a pretty good call. And then the other call out was Kyren Williams, which was kind of a miss. But Williams did start to see that dip in production as the season went on. So last year at running back, overall okay, but nothing amazing. Wide receiver and tight end really crushed last year. Listen to the top 5 values at wide receiver according to market score last season. Puka Nacua was first with a market score of 2.8. He crushed. Jalen Waddle was next and he played 2.2 points per game above expected. And then it was George Pickens. He destroyed. AJ Brown was next. He technically actually played above ADP expectation, though it wasn't a great year. And then lastly, Chris Olave. I mean, that's a solid group of 5 players. You had 3 league-winning wide receivers in that group. And then on the flip side, market score didn't like Marvin Harrison the most. That's a W. Stephon Diggs was on there. That was kind of whatever. But so was Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and DK Metcalf. Market score literally said Justin Jefferson had a score of -1 last year. I think that's pretty cool. And then listen to the top 4 tight end values last year. The tight ends with the highest market scores. Tyler Warren, George Kittle, Tucker Kraft, and Trey McBride. Here are the worst values. Evan Ingram, David Njoku, TJ Hawkinson, and Travis Kelce. Now, some of these names were predictable without using market score. Of course. A lot of them were targets. A lot of them were avoids in the draft guide last year. But just like the ZAP models, I think market score can serve as a metric that can ground us. If we're really high on a player, but market score says, hey, this is a red flag situation, maybe we look into that player a little bit more. And I feel that way a little bit about guys being drafted here in 2026. Not so much at quarterback, though. The player with the best market score is, drumroll please, Josh freaking Allen. Go figure. The model just loves him for obvious reasons. But he's sitting with a market score of 2.3. And that's at an overall ADP of 29th overall. At 29th overall, his expected points per game is 20.3. So market score implies something closer to 22.6. Other names at the top of the list right now include Jackson Dart, which I thought was pretty interesting, Cam Ward, which I thought was really interesting, Jalen Hurts once again, and then Justin Herbert. All players that I can definitely get behind in one way or another. Now, on the flip side, the biggest call out is definitely Matthew Stafford. Beyond him, there aren't a ton of red flag players. But Stafford's got a score of -2.5, which really is a number that we don't see that much from a non-elite quarterback. Funny enough, back in 2022, Matthew Stafford was the QB 12, and he had a market score of -1.6. In 9 games that year, he played 5.3 points per game below expected. Now, I highly doubt that happens. But we know regression is coming for Stafford, so it's no surprise that he's at the bottom of the list when you consider cost, which is 94th overall in QB 13. The running back list actually shocked me a little bit. Kyle Monangai and Blake Corum, 2 players I literally just talked about last week as high floor, kind of low ceiling without an injury type of players. Market score loves them. They have scores of almost 2. On the red flag side, it's Kyren Williams, who I think the model just doesn't like in general for a number of reasons, but it's Kyren Williams and Tony Pollard. The fact that my analysis on Pollard called him a fade, and then this is saying that he'll play 1.8 points per game below expected, It's not looking great. Now, after last year's wide receiver showing, I was pretty interested to see what Market Score said about this year's group. And we got familiar faces at the top. Puka Nacua and George Pickens. Jordan Tyson was actually third on the list. A lot of that has to do with the fact that rookies get treated differently within the model because we don't have previous season data. And unsurprisingly, the Market Score model uses ZAP scores as an input because ZAP score is predictive. And the ZAP model loved Jordan Tyson, so this model likes him a lot too. Carnell Tate's really high too, as is Wan'Dale Robinson, Alec Pierce, and Terry McLaurin. Market Score just seems to really like this Tennessee passing attack, which is kind of frightening. On the flip side, as much as it pains me, it's not vibing much with Emeka Egbuka. That's something that's going to want to make me investigate further. It also doesn't really like Quentin Johnston. And then the last call out is CeeDee Lamb. So it likes Pickens at his ADP, but it doesn't like Lamb at his ADP. It doesn't mean that it likes Pickens straight up more than Lamb. Remember, this is all versus cost. And Lamb's a 10th overall pick according to this ADP, Pickens 26th. And then lastly, tight end. I thought this was pretty funny. I mentioned some tight ends on last week's mailbag episode without even looking at Market Score. And literally 3 of the top 4 tight ends by Market Score are players that I mentioned. Greg Dulcich is number 1, Tucker Kraft is number 2, Pat Freiermuth is number 3, and Jawan Johnson is number 4. On the other end, it's got a bunch of rookie tight ends, and then Brock Bowers is actually viewed as overvalued, though I wouldn't overthink that. David Njoku, Jake Ferguson, and Dallas Goedert round things off on the red flag side. Now, all of those names are going to change as the summer moves forward, because average draft position changes. We're still very early on in this process, but as we get into August when our drafts are happening, we'll have a pretty good idea of which players Market Score is into and which players it isn't. And there's no doubt I'm going to be referencing those scores both on the podcast and in the draft guide this year. There's so much to still uncover with this metric. This is really the 2.0 of late round fantasy football. We've got this new website, we have this new members hub, but Brandon Gadula and I, we're also working on a ton of these different ways that we can dissect this game through numbers and analytics. Market Score is awesome. It's something that we want to continue to develop and make better. But beyond Market Score, there's more on the way too. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back in your ears on Wednesday, live on YouTube for the Late Round Fantasy Football Show. And then on Friday, you get an episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.
When you're a maintenance engineer in a beverage manufacturing plant, you keep production lines moving and quality on track because there's no room for slowdowns. With Grainger's vast selection of high-quality motors, sensors, belts, and hard-to-find parts, you can get what you need fast and all in one place, so nothing gets in the way of getting the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Lots of places can expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity, which is way more than anyone can do on their own. If we find anything suspicious, like new loans or changes to your financial accounts, we alert you right away. All through text, phone, email, or the LifeLock app. Save up to 30% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/iHeart. Terms apply.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.